Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke media briefing on voting in the US. I'm Greg Phillips with Duke Communications. The US Senate is considering a bill to expand voting rights, just as more than a dozen states across the country, including North Carolina, move to enact new laws that would impose limits on voting. With us today to discuss this push and pull is Sunshine Hillygus. She is a professor of political science and public policy who studies American political behavior, including young voters, campaigns and elections, and survey methods. Professor Hillygus, good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. The Senate bill includes a long list of changes, but what could be the overall impact on voting and elections if this package passes?
I mean, it is multifaceted in the way that it will have an impact on voters, and particularly in light of, you said more than a dozen states, but it is well more than a dozen states. I think the last count I saw was that there were something like well over 300 different restrictions in more than 40 states that have been proposed since the last election. And so you have incredible variation across the states in access to registration and voting. And what this Senate bill will do is provide some consistency. And frankly, among the things that I think could be most important in terms of their impact on elections, it is not actually kind of access to the vote, but also the attempt to reduce partisan gerrymandering. And so again, the potential impact is huge. But I don't have a ton of confidence that it will in fact be passed. I hope that this discussion and where things are potentially could lead to pieces of the legislation ultimately moving forward, even if it doesn't look like even the Manchin compromise bill will be successful.
Gotcha, thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned that the efforts at the state level, which is what we're going to talk about now, are so numerous. I ended up saying a dozen because it seemed like there were more emerging every day. And I thought, well, I know it's more than a dozen, but there certainly are a lot. And I want to move on to talk about those now. And obviously, there are far too many, as you mentioned, for us to go by one. But are there any of the state laws that are under consideration or already passed so far that stand out to you for any particular reason?
Yeah, I think some of the ones that are most concerning, I mean, again, there are dozens upon dozens that are being considered. Some of them I think are just, far more, I mean, I think that they are significant in part, not necessarily because of just their impact, because in a lot of cases, the likely impact will potentially could be relatively small given the research in political science, but very targeted to young voters, to communities of color, to those who are poor. So they are very narrow sometimes in their kind of their actual policy change in terms of the rules of when and where and how individuals are likely to vote. But the rhetoric and the polarization surrounding these discussions is terrifying to see that access to the vote has become so politicized. And so I guess one of the things that a couple of the laws that I think are particularly scary are ones that take the power out of the local elections and increases the power of partisan legislatures in terms of deciding election results. And I guess the other point that I'd really like to draw home, and across all of these different voting restrictions, that number one, that the rhetoric has turned so polarized and politicized about voting, and the assumption seems to be on both sides of the aisle that inevitably that making voting easier will benefit the Democrats, that making voting harder will benefit Republicans. And that simply doesn't match to the reality of the empirical evidence. I think it's harmful in terms of the interpretation of and motivation for these various laws. And so it has really shifted the conversation away from, how is it that we as a democracy should be governing the rules about when, where, and how people should vote, and instead has made it about what will give one side a strategic advantage or not. And again, I see these conversations on both sides and think it's incredibly harmful that, and wrong, frankly, in terms of what people's expectations are about who is likely to benefit. I mean, you consider the fact that there was this long-running assumption that when motor voter was passed, that was somehow going to be a boon for Democrats, and that wasn't the case. Pre-registration, which is a law that allows 16 and 17-year-olds to fill out their registration form so that they're automatically registered to vote once they turn 18. Research that I've done in my latest book, Making Young Voters, shows that is not something that is necessarily benefiting Democrats. In the state of North Carolina, for instance, that was most used by those who were registering as unaffiliated. And so, when we talk about and implement these voting restrictions, this should not be a conversation about which side is going to be a benefit. It should be about how do we give citizens access to the vote and make it easier to participate in democracy.
Sure, thank you very much. As you mentioned, there are over 300 state laws across the country that are currently either passed or under consideration. And you've talked before about how variation across states creates problematic confusion, for voters. Can you talk a little bit about how that works and why it's important?
Yes, particularly for new voters, or imagine, for instance, college students who have come from out of state. So this is where, again, young voters are among the ones who are most likely to be impacted by changes in laws. And North Carolina is certainly at the center of this, given the ups and downs of voter identification, where it was passed and then litigated and passed again. And what we found in talking with some mobilization organizations is that they ended up putting their money elsewhere in one election cycle because they weren't sure what the rules of the game would be. So litigation right now, if we make the assumption that the For the People Act is not going to be passed, then litigation becomes a way that and is going to be what we will be looking at over the course of the next several years in terms of figuring out if these voting restrictions are constitutional or not, in terms of violating the Voting Rights Act or potentially violating the 26th Amendment if they disproportionately affect young people. And that litigation creates considerable confusion, uncertainty that both makes it more difficult for new voters to figure out what they need to do in order to enter into the system, but also create confusion and difficulty for organizations looking to, strategically put money into a state to be able to get people to the polls. And so, granted, I suppose that we are now at the point that there are so many states that are considering various voting restrictions that, it won't just be North Carolina that is facing this uncertainty, but, at a certain point, this can't be a good, it's very hard for the U.S. to claim that we, have a stable and healthy democracy, and in light of this just wave of efforts to change the rules of voting.
Sure, thank you. We are going to open it up to questions now. So thanks to those reporters who already sent questions. We're going to get to those in a moment. Those of you joining us on Zoom can submit questions via the Q&A window at any time. You can also ask questions in person by raising your hand. If you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9, and we can unmute you so you can ask your question. To start off, we've had a question about the case in Arizona. And for background, on March 2nd, the Supreme Court is expected to hear oral arguments in a challenge to a couple of Arizona voting policies that would make it harder for people to vote. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that case and the importance to other states of the Supreme Court ruling on it when it comes.
Yeah, I mean, as we know, once the Voting Rights Act was Section 5, which required preclearance for states that had a history of suppressing the vote of minorities. It meant that Section 2 became the primary way that voting rights were being enforced. And now what Section 2 though requires is that after the fact, there has to be a demonstration that both that minorities were disproportionately affected and that the source of that effect was not simply like socioeconomic status or something like that, but in fact a result of discrimination. And I think that there's some uncertainty. My sense of the Supreme Court is that they are not necessarily looking to gut Section 2. On the other hand, I think that they have, it partly depends on who's going to be the justice that's going to be writing the opinion. The concern is that Alito could be the one handling it, in which case that I think makes a lot of election attorneys and civil rights attorneys concerned. I think there's some hope that Breyer will be the one writing the opinion, and that in fact it might be his last opinion before retirement. I think that is what people hope will be the best case. I think that this Supreme Court has time and time again, thinking about, for instance, with partisan gerrymandering, pointed to the fact that it is the legislature that needs to be making the rules about elections. Unfortunately, what we're seeing currently in the Senate is an inability to do that, which means that, again, litigation is going to be a primary route. This is certainly not going to be the last time that the Supreme Court is taking up issues of voting rights and access to registration and voting. And in fact, I think one of the topics that many journalists will be focusing on in a few months is when the redistricting data is released by the Census Bureau, if in fact it can be released by August 16th. There are going to be just a lot of questions and concerns and potentially litigation about racial and partisan gerrymandering, and so that's going to be, I think, one of the key questions. And frankly, in the HR1, the Senate bill right now that is being considered, I do think that the taking redistricting out of the hands of partisan legislatures is one of the kind of most impactful potential reforms that could be passed. And the question is if this bill doesn't move forward, can aspects of the bill be passed on their own?
Thank you very much for that. We'll shift to talking about North Carolina for a little bit now. Of course, North Carolina has certainly seen its share of gerrymandering. and was also one of the states that required preclearance. And just for context, for anybody on the call that's not clear about that, preclearance was the section of the Voting Rights Act that required some states, including North Carolina, to get pre-approval from the Justice Department for any changes to polling places and other aspects of elections that the Supreme Court did away with several years ago. So we've had some questions about the bills currently being advanced in North Carolina by Republicans. Jordan Wilkie from Carolina Public Press points out that those Republicans maintain the changes are bipartisan, although Democrats have voted almost unanimously against them so far. So, so far, some of those bills include making the State Board of Elections rather than the DMV responsible for the voter registration system. Another one that we've seen in other states would change the absentee by mail receipt deadline to Election Day rather than 3 days later, as long as it was postmarked by Election Day. And another one would prevent the use of private funds being used for the administration of elections. Now, his question is, because these are quite technical in nature and pertain only to North Carolina law, do they line up with the national trend of restrictions that we're seeing imposed elsewhere? And if so, like how closely do they track to those efforts?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting and we see in a lot of states is that the pairing of voting restrictions with what on the face of it might seem like expansion. And I think that those North Carolina laws are one type of example of that. So you might say, why in the world would it be a problem for you to expand the number of places that somebody could register to vote online? And in fact, online voter registration is hugely important, and particularly for young voters. And yet, as you say, right, it really is about the devil is in the details. And once you have two different sources, and in particular, once you have a source that critically doesn't have access to a signature on the part of the registrant, and doesn't currently have funding built into the bill in terms of funding the type of processes necessary to make that compliant to be able to actually, get through with registration. What I worry about is the extent to which that increases confusion, right? So that rather than us being able to say, go to this link to be able to register to vote, there will be two different links, and until there is additional information or additional changes, essentially potentially different sets of instructions with each of those. Likewise, you might say, like, why would we ever be opposed to one of the other bills that proposes a mobile unit to go around and give people voter IDs to those that don't have it? I think the real question is what will be the reach and the equity and the details of whether or not that will actually be able to mitigate the potential impact of having voter ID. And then finally, kind of the easiest one, I think, for people to grasp is this change in the deadline. Across the nation, there really is a split in whether your mail-in ballot has to be received by Election Day, or if there's a grace period after Election Day in which those votes can still be counted. I think fundamentally the issue becomes, can the voter trust that when they put that ballot in the mail that it will be counted? And given delays with the post office recently, given delays in various states and actually getting ballots to the voters, that's where these are issues that could be exacerbated. There's more than 11,000 people who would have been disenfranchised by that change in grace period in 2020. So, they are quite technical. They are ones that are difficult to debate or explain to the general public. At the same time, they are putting the North Carolina GOP, straight into the same type of potential for criticism that we are seeing across the country. And one thing that we haven't really talked about, but in terms of thinking about the impact of these various voting restrictions, there is very likely the case that, what we saw in Georgia was this backlash, that this effort to frame voting restrictions as voter suppression became a mobilizing call. And I think there is a real question, and potentially this should be of concern to Republicans, about the extent to which these actions, many of them, like you say, are kind of technical and potentially small, instead, really help to, put the fire under folks like Stacey Abrams and others, and serves as a bit of a rallying cry. And so one of the things that again, I think it's difficult to anticipate what the actual impact will be in the immediate next election, in part because it is going to be used to fundraise and mobilize, and then what the subsequent effect will be down the road, particularly because some of these laws are combined with a little bit of expansion in one way and restriction in the other way, and so I will certainly say that political scientists who study this will have their hands full over the coming years, just because there have been so many rule changes since 2020.
Sure, absolutely. And you started to address this a moment ago, but we've had questions to ask if you could follow up a little bit about how you mentioned about how voting restrictions often don't end up working as people assume they will. Can you talk about maybe some of the unanticipated effects that we've seen with voting law changes in the past, or how sometimes they don't work out as planned?
Sure. I think the assumption seems to be that you make voting easier, and it's going to inevitably benefit Democrats, and that simply isn't always the case. When you make registration and voting easier, what you tend to do is expand the pool to reach people who are somewhat less partisan, somewhat less activist, right? The lower propensity voters, and it turns out they are far more difficult to predict how they're going to vote, and far more likely to be the type that change their, partisan leanings or their voting from one election to the next. And even when we look at mail-in voting, so a lot of the restrictions across the country have attempted to kind of put restrictions on absentee or mail-in voting, and from 2010 to 2016, that was used more by Republicans than Democrats in the state of North Carolina. So it is a mistake to assume that because you see a particular pattern of support that young people were more likely to vote Democratic in the last election cycle, that that is forever and always going to be the case. And in fact, young voters are ones who are, again, far more likely to be changing and responsive to government performance and changes over time. So in my book, Making Young Voters, that just came out this past year, one of the things that we really focus on is the fact that there are some rules, that changes and election reforms that have an impact on young voters that don't in other cases. So early voting, for instance, doesn't really increase turnout among young voters, whereas pre-registration does. And at the same time, pre-registration is more likely to be used by unaffiliated young voters than by either Democratic or Republican young voters. And in fact, in what we show is in the state of Florida, that the introduction of pre-registration actually kind of narrowed the gap, the advantage that Democrats have among young voters. So the point is just that all of these assumptions that are being made about the partisan impact of easing voting rules or increasing voting restrictions are oftentimes, not grounded in reality. And so, it is both concerning to see that being the potential motivation for some of these rules and the conversations around why we should have some law in place versus not. So, what I really wish we were doing was, we could go back in time to when there was, bipartisan support for, making it easier for people to vote. We are past that point, but it's one of the things that I think is most concerning about, whatever laws get passed, the fact that the motivation is not simply about election integrity or about access to the vote.
Sure, thank you very much. We have a raised hand among the audience. So Michael McElroy, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. So the assumption that these laws would have an effect one way or the other on a partisan basis, if those are flawed, is the assumption that voters of color would be disproportionately affected by these laws. Is that also flawed? And if it's not, can you tell me how some of these rules, especially in North Carolina, would affect voters of color more often?
Yeah, I think there's pretty clear evidence that voters of color are more likely to be affected, just in terms of looking at who has, for instance, a voter ID or not, who, when you start talking about who's most likely to use Sunday early voting, and like all the various rules across the country that we've seen, there is certainly reason to expect, right, that there will be some Section 2 violations. I think that taking that as a reality does not necessarily, and yes, it is the case that at least for African-American voters, that does have implications likely for support for Democrats. But, as we saw in the last election cycle, it's wrong to assume that, all groups of Hispanics will vote the same way, for instance, that all groups of young people will vote the same way. And what is the case is that some of these laws, that while they will disproportionately hurt minorities, that minorities are disproportionately affected by them, they are also impacting rural, uneducated white voters. They are also impacting young voters who are less predictable. They are also impacting elderly voters. And so, in terms of what the impact is, the different ones will have different impacts on different groups. I think that what we will see is that absolutely communities of color are disproportionately affected, but that the impact on the partisan advantage or disadvantage, because there are other groups also impacted, is far less clear. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you very much. We are going to wrap up here shortly, but before we go, I wanted to ask you again, you had mentioned that there are a lot of these voting laws that tend to get a lot of attention, like the one about kind of handing out water in line. But you made the point that the laws that affect one way or another turnout, or the laws that affect voter registration, tend to be the most impactful and more important than some of these other ones. Can you talk a little bit about why that is?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that we have seen in our research, including the research that we've done in making young voters, is that the rules, the electoral reforms, or the voting restrictions that most impact turnout are ones that make it more difficult for people to register. And once people are experienced voters, that they are far more likely, more confident, more able to navigate changes in rules. So, one of the things that empirical research has found is that, where it really has an impact on turnout is when you're talking about things like same-day registration, that has a much bigger impact on turnout than the number of days of early voting. So, it tends to be the case that the voters who use early voting are those who, they will show up on election day if they have to. Now, I'm not getting into a normative point about, what we should be doing, but just to say that the people who are most impacted by voting restrictions are those who have not yet entered into the election system. And so once you can get people registered, and this is why automatic voter registration, pre-registration, same day registration, things that make it easier for people to register to vote are among the most important in terms of increasing turnout. And that's particularly for young people and people of color. And so, if I was to, be able to wave a wand and say, what's the one thing that I would like to keep and save in that Senate bill, it really is about redistricting and about the registration rules. And to me, those are the ones that are going to be most impactful. And you consider the fact, right, that in most countries, people are not having to register to vote. I mean, one of the reasons that the US overall has a lower turnout level compared to most other modern democracies has to do with the hurdles that we have to jump through in order to be able to vote.
Sure, thank you. And one final point before we go, in your opening remarks, you used the word terrifying when you talked about how just the notion of registering to vote, the notion of casting your vote has become politicized, just pure access to the ballots. Have we seen that kind of polarization over merely the act of voting in American history before? And if so, like, how do we is there a way that we can back out of that? Because we've seen everything become more polarized. Now voting itself is polarized. Have we seen it before? And if so, how do we depolarize that, if that's even possible? And I realize that's kind of a broad crystal ball kind of question.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew the answer. I mean, I will say that, I direct the polarization lab, co-direct the polarization lab here on campus. And it is one of the things that we are very much interested in is how can we unroll? I mean, I do think that academics and academic research has a role because, part of it is that we have really been able to show through research that this assumption about the strategic advantage is flawed. Now, that message isn't necessarily getting out to, elected officials who are passing these laws or to the public. But, I think that, academic research is very much part of the answer in being able to test some of these assumptions underlying the what I would think is like kind of a nefarious motivation for passing these election laws. And so, but it remains to be the case, right? That I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer, and I mean, I just I like to emphasize to people as often as I can to say, you shouldn't just assume, demography is not destiny is a line we like to say, and you cannot assume that every young person is going to vote Democratic. I mean, young people were actually supporting, Trump in some states. You can't assume that, all Latinos are going to vote Democratic, or that all uneducated white rural voters are voting Trump. That we have to, really back up and think about what is best for increasing voter turnout and participation in democracy overall. And I wish I had a better answer as to how we get there.
Sure, absolutely. If there was a simple answer, then we wouldn't be polarized in the first place. But I would urge everybody to check out the Polarization Lab at polarizationlab.com. We have featured Professor Hillygus and other members of the Polarization Lab on our briefings before, which you can find on the YouTube channel, because obviously it is a huge subject. We will call it there. I would say thank you very much to Professor Sunshine Hillygus for sharing your perspective with us. Next week, we will be returning to the topic of COVID-19 to discuss safe approaches to the next school year, given that younger children won't be able to get vaccinated before then. If you'd like to be notified of that and other upcoming briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu. And if you're watching on YouTube, just like and subscribe. In the meantime, please get yourself and your teenagers vaccinated, register to vote, and always be kind. Thanks, and have a great day.